All right, let's dive into one of the most chaotic, earth-shattering, and just plain important periods in all of European history. We're talking about the 167 years between the Peace of Westphalia and the Congress of Vienna. This isn't just a chapter in a textbook. It's when the modern world was pretty much forged in fire. So here's the big question we're really tackling today. How did Europe go from a world of absolute kings who basically owned their countries, to a world of citizen armies, where entire nations went to war for an idea? I mean, think about that for a second. It's a mind-blowing transformation. And to understand how it happened, we've got to start at the beginning.
Okay, so these two dates, 1648 and 1815, there are bookends. 1648 basically ends the massive religious wars and locks in the idea of independent states. And 1815, that's when all the old powers tried to desperately stuff the genie of revolution back into the bottle. Everything that happens in between is just non-stop action.
Our first stop on this wild ride, the world on fire, global markets and British power. You see, the spark that lit the whole fuse wasn't in some dusty throne room. Nope, it was out on the open ocean. A new global economy was booming, and with it came incredible riches and rivalries so fierce they would tear the old world apart.
Just look at this chart. It tells you pretty much everything you need to know about who was running the show in the 18th century. It all came down to naval power. The British Royal Navy wasn't just a bunch of ships, it was a global chokehold. France was a land power, sure, but Britain ruled the seas. And when the game is global trade, the one who controls the seas controls the world. It's as simple as that. A perfect example of this is the War of Spanish Succession. All of Europe was terrified that France and Spain would merge into this unstoppable supermonarchy. And the Treaty of Utrecht, which ended the war, shows you just how smart the British were. Yeah, they got some land, but the real prize was something called the Asiento. This gave them the exclusive, incredibly profitable right to supply enslaved people to the Spanish colonies. This was a massive economic win that basically cemented their dominance of the Atlantic. And all this rivalry, it eventually exploded into what many people call the real First World War. I mean, the 7 Years' War was fought everywhere: Europe, North America, India, and when the dust settled, Britain was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. France was pretty much booted out of its major colonies. But, and this is a huge but, winning a world war is insanely expensive. Both Britain and France were now broke, absolutely drowning in debt. And that debt, that is going to be a major problem.
And that massive war debt? Well, that leads us right into our next section. The old regime cracks, the French Revolution. Because when a powerful kingdom like France is on the edge of bankruptcy, and you mix in some explosive new Enlightenment ideas, well, things start to break.
Okay, look at this. This chart basically shows why France was a ticking time bomb. You have three social classes, the estates. The top two, the clergy and the nobles, make up about 3% of the population. They have all the land, all the power, and pay practically zero taxes. So who pays for everything, including those giant war debts we just talked about? Yep, the other 97%. You can see how that's just not going to work, right? The system was completely broken.
But this wasn't just about taxes. It was about a complete rewiring of how people saw themselves. Before, you were a subject. Your whole life was defined by your duty to a king. But the Enlightenment came along with this radical new idea, the citizen. A citizen doesn't just have duties, they have rights. They're not owned by the state, they are the state. This one idea, from subject to citizen, is the rocket fuel for the entire French Revolution.
Now, the revolution wasn't like flipping a switch. It happened in phases. First, you get the moderate phase. Everyone's still kind of hopeful, writing declarations, pushing for a constitutional monarchy. You know, a king who has to follow some rules. But then, things got complicated. Threats from inside and outside France made people paranoid, and the whole thing spiraled into the radical phase. And that's when things get bloody. We're talking execution of the king, the reign of terror. It gets dark fast.
And this right here, this is one of the most game-changing and honestly terrifying ideas to come out of that radical phase. The levée en masse. This wasn't a draft. This was the idea that the entire nation goes to war. Every able-bodied man was now a soldier. All of a sudden, France has the biggest army Europe has ever seen, and it's not fighting for a king's glory. It's fighting for an idea. It's a citizen army, and it's ready to spread the revolution by force.
So when you have that much chaos and bloodshed, what happens? You get a power vacuum. And that brings us to our third big shift. Order from chaos, Napoleon and the conservative reaction. Someone had to step in and clean up the mess. That someone was Napoleon Bonaparte.
His promise? To bring order to France, while the rest of Europe tried to shut the whole experiment down for good.
You really can't talk about this era without talking about Napoleon. He's such a complicated figure. On the one hand, he's the son of the revolution. I mean, he wasn't a noble, he rose to the top purely on talent, which is what the revolution was all about. But on the other hand, he's its executioner. He basically decided that to save the revolution's ideals, he had to destroy its democracy and make himself emperor. A total paradox.
And let's be clear, Napoleon wasn't just some guy on a horse. The man was a genius at running a country. He took the best ideas of the revolution and made them permanent. The Napoleonic Code, it meant everyone was equal under the law. He made peace with the Catholic Church, which calmed things down. And he built a government where you got a job because you were good at it, not because of who your dad was. He created a modern, super efficient state.
So, at the absolute peak of his power, in 1812 he gets this brilliant idea: invade Russia. He puts together the largest European army ever seen up to that point, the Grande Armée. How many soldiers? 600,000.
And how many came back? About 40,000. The brutal Russian winter, the scorched earth tactics, they just swallowed his army whole. It was an absolute catastrophe. And this wasn't just a loss, it broke him. The myth of the invincible Napoleon was shattered, forever.
So after Napoleon is finally defeated for good, the old powers get together at the Congress of Vienna, and their #1 goal is to make sure this never, ever happens again. Their guiding idea was the balance of power. The point wasn't to totally crush France. The point was to set up the chessboard so no single country could get strong enough to run the table and try to conquer the continent again.
But while all the diplomats are busy redrawing maps, something else is happening, a totally different kind of rebellion. This is our fourth transformation, the Hearts Rebellion, the rise of Romanticism. It was a massive cultural backlash against the cold, hard logic of the Enlightenment, which a lot of people blame for leading straight to the bloodshed of the guillotine.
And this breaks it down perfectly. The Enlightenment was all about reason, logic, and universal truths that applied to everyone. Romanticism was the complete opposite. It was about raw emotion, your gut feeling, your intuition. It wasn't about what's true for everybody, it was about what's true for you. A huge shift from the head to the heart.
And the guy who really kicked this all off, kind of the godfather of Romanticism, was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, he was technically an Enlightenment thinker, but he was the one who stood up and said, hey, wait a minute, what about feelings? What about the heart? He argued that pure reason just wasn't enough to understand what it means to be human.
And this wasn't just about art and poetry, it had huge political consequences. Because when you start focusing on unique folktales, shared history, and common languages, you get nationalism. Romanticism gave nationalism its emotional charge. Suddenly, being German or Italian wasn't just about where you lived. It was a deep, powerful feeling, an identity that was a direct threat to the old multi-ethnic empires.
All right, let's bring it all home. Our final section is a new European order, synthesis, and legacy. Because the key takeaway here is that 1815 wasn't an endpoint. It was the messy, chaotic birth of the modern world.
So what did this whole period leave us with? Well, we get mass politics, the idea that ordinary people matter. We get the powerful force of national identity. We get modern, total war, where the whole nation fights. We get the balance of power idea in diplomacy. And most importantly, we get the ideological playbook for all the revolutions that are going to rock Europe for the next 100 years.
Which leaves us with one last big question. The old conservative order that was set up in Vienna, it worked. It brought peace, but it did it by trying to squash these incredibly powerful new forces of nationalism and revolution. So the real question becomes, how long can you really keep the lid on that kind of pressure cooker before it explodes all over again?